And this evening, we are going to be joined by Amanda McQuaid from New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping things to get us started, and then I will get us quickly turned over to Amanda because I'm sure she has a lot to share with us. As I just said, the meeting is being recorded. We will ask that you stay muted for the duration of the webinar. If you leave your camera on, remember that everybody can see you. And if we seem to be having a problem with bandwidth, you may want to turn your camera off. It can help with those issues. We have a chat box. If you've been to our webinars before, you're probably familiar with this, or if you've been using Zoom, you probably know how to do this already, but you will see that there's a chat box at the bottom or maybe at the top of your screen. You can direct questions to the presenter. We will keep track of those and have them ready for Amanda at the end of the presentation, and hopefully we'll have time to get to everybody's questions. In the meantime, myself and Gloria, my coworker, will be trying to answer questions if we have the answer, but we may not. Tomorrow you'll receive an evaluation form. So please do fill that out and give us your feedback. We're always trying to improve our webinars. It's also an opportunity to tell us what other things you might be interested in learning about. I am in the process of setting up our fall and winter webinar series, so I am certainly looking to see what people want to hear about. And I also send out an email with the link to the webinar recording, so you can share that with others who may be interested in it, or if you know someone who wasn't able to tune in tonight. So New Hampshire Lakes, we are the only publicly supported nonprofit organization working for all of New Hampshire's 1,000 lakes. You can help us achieve our mission and give these wonderful webinars by becoming a supporter. You can do that right on our website. We are running a special this month for New Hampshire lake keepers. If you become a monthly donor, we're giving out some great prizes, so check that out. We want to work for the lakes to keep them clean and healthy now and in the future. We work with our partners, promote clean water policies and responsible use, and inspire the public to take care of our lakes. We do that through 3 of our programs. We have an advocacy program where we're doing work at the State House to change, laws and guidelines for people. We have our conservation programs where we run our lake host program, making sure that boaters have the help they need to remove invasive species from their boats before they come out of, after they come out of the lake, before they go into another lake. We also have our Lake Smart program, which is a program where homeowners can do things on their own property, even if you don't live at the lake, that are going to be good for the lake. And then, of course, our outreach program, which brings you educational stuff, just like this webinar you're seeing tonight. I want to give a quick shout out to Grapponi Automotive Group. They've been a longtime supporter of New Hampshire Lakes. They are the presenting sponsor for our Explore Lakes with New Hampshire Lakes webinar series. They've done an excellent job of helping us bring programs like this to the public. They're also just an excellent organization to work with. I've bought both of my last 2 vehicles with them, and they do a really great job. It's quick and easy. If you are looking for a new vehicle, I strongly recommend working with them. They're out of Bow, New Hampshire. And your host this evening, myself, as well as Gloria Norcross. She's the Conservation Program Assistant. Hi, Gloria. And our expert presenter this evening is Amanda McQuaid. So at this time, I will stop sharing my screen and allow her to bring up her presentation for the evening.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you, New Hampshire Lakes, for inviting me here tonight to talk about my favorite subject, cyanobacteria. Thank you all for being here to talk about cyanobacteria. I'm going to try to keep this short so we have time for just questions and answers and discussion. But yeah, I will be speaking about cyanobacteria tonight, and this is my contact information, and I hope that you record that cell phone number in case you ever see a bloom. We are hoping that you will take a photo and send it on over. Let's see. Sorry, I always get confused on what the controls are for advancing a screen. Sorry, here I go. So I'd like to just first introduce the concept of plankton, because I think when you go to a lake, you don't really think of all the tiny plants and animals that are around you. And a simple plankton net here in the photos here can really concentrate all the particles in the water. And plankton are just microscopic organisms that are drifting or floating in the water. And there's so many different types. And this ranges from plants to bacteria to little animals basically in the water. So there's a huge diversity of organisms in the lake, including cyanobacteria. When you really look at what these plants are, these phytoplankton are microscopic plants, and cyanobacteria are not truly plants. They're not really algae, but they're in this category. And we monitor them just to determine how the water quality is sometimes. Sometimes these certain organisms can give us a sense of water quality. These things also change seasonally. So we have things like diatoms that are very common in oceans and clean oligotrophic lakes. We see them in most of all of our lakes, and they're very common in the winter time. We have golden browns. We sometimes have golden brown blooms, and sometimes that can be confused with cyanobacteria, and the water can look a little bit brown or smell a bit fishy. We have dinoflagellates that kind of move around with flagella. We have a huge category of green algae or chlorophyta, and those are considered like the good, clean, green, organisms, like the vegetables and the salads of the lakes. And then there's cyanobacteria, which is a complicated topic we'll discuss. There's euglenoids that are sort of like these plant animal like organisms. There's yellow greens, and this is not even a complete list, but there's just a huge range of different types of microscopic plants and bacteria. And again, the combination of them can really be telling of water quality. And so more specifically, cyanobacteria has been sort of a parameter for indications of eutrophication. And if you're not familiar with that term, we classify our lakes based on a variety of parameters, mainly water clarity and nutrients, chlorophyll levels. And some of these then get placed in these different categories that really are categorizing lakes based on how much productivity is in the water or how much phytoplankton really is in the water. And so some of our ultra oligotrophic lakes barely have anything in them. They're just void of life sometimes. And that's, maybe nice if you want to live at a lake that's sort of like a pool, but they are considered nutrient deplete and they don't really have a lot of stuff growing. A lot of the lakes in New Hampshire are oligotrophic, in other words, few phytoplankton, clean water parameters. Probably more common is mesotrophic status, where there's sort of a mix, like sort of moderate level of phytoplankton and other water quality parameters that match that. And then we're kind of getting into the category where cyanobacteria can sort of push a lake into more of a eutrophic condition, more phytoplankton, more algal growth, more nutrients, less water clarity. And, we like to go to our lakes and be able to say it's clear and all nice and clean. And so these categories can kind of give you an indication of what to expect for a lake. And a lot of these lakes are moving into more of a more eutrophic status. And that does have a lot to do with a lot of factors, climate change being a very large factor, because that does bring a change in other parameters like temperature, stratification, pH and acidification, rainfall, more extreme storm events, and then of course nutrients. A lot of these storms will bring in more excess nutrients that help feed cyanobacteria and algae very quickly. And so researchers do kind of use cyanobacteria as another determining factor for how things are going, because they do tend to outcompete and really grow fast against the other phytoplankton. Just so you know a little bit about cyanobacteria and what we're talking about, if you're not aware, they are formally known as blue-green algae. And I think it's important that everyone remember that term because they're one and the same. Blue-green algae is cyanobacteria. It's just that they are not actually truly algae. They're just photosynthetic bacteria that kind of benefit from utilizing the sun's energy. They've been around forever, so they're nothing new. There's nothing invasive really about cyanobacteria, and they are just very diverse. There's thousands of species. There's hundreds of toxins. We're learning about toxins more and more every day. And they're ubiquitous in the environment, meaning that they can really be found anywhere, including, you know, the air, the trees, the soil. So cyanobacteria is not just a freshwater issue. They're really everywhere in some form, and they're ubiquitous globally. So this is not, you know, an issue just in the United States or anywhere really. It's global. Even the Arctic lakes have cyanobacteria. And, you know, why we are very concerned about cyanobacteria is that they're complicated. They produce all of these different secondary metabolites. They have their own sort of package of chemicals. And these are cyanotoxins and other things, but namely some of the more common cyanotoxins we see can produce a wide range of symptoms. And some things are debatable. There's a lot of research out there finding different results, different sort of contradictory things. But when it comes down to it, there are these compounds that can do these things to animal cells. It can be as mild as a skin irritation to some more chronic issues with cancer and neurodegenerative disease. And there's a lot that researchers do not understand about cyanotoxins and how we are exposed. However, some of these toxins are very well studied, and we can clearly see that there are effects from ingestion of these toxins one way or another. When we think about blooms in New Hampshire, I think that we're mostly concerned about our dogs. I think that if any one of us were to go to our lake, our favorite lake, and look down at the beach, you would be concerned if the water was green. It's just sort of in New Hampshire, we're conditioned to pretty clean water, luckily. But, you know, we're also human, and we would probably not go and, you know, drink the green scum on the beach, but our dogs do, and they like to. And they also like to roll in weird, gross things and then groom themselves. So dogs are very vulnerable to cyanobacteria. And there's a few studies showing the correlation of exposure to freshwater blooms and confirmed cases of canine intoxication. So there are several studies out there that support this idea that dogs are vulnerable to the toxins and blooms of cyanobacteria create. But of course, you want to know, like, well, how does this affect people? And there's a lot of things we don't understand, again, about this stuff. But we know that ingestion, swallowing contaminated water, even if you're swimming, you sometimes swallow a little bit of water. You could be eating food, not just seafood, anything really that could bioaccumulate cyanotoxins. Inhalation is something that we've been studying in New Hampshire. Just breathing in aerosolized toxins is another route for exposure. And then more mildly and very more common is skin contact. And we do get a lot of reports of people getting eye and ear irritations after being exposed to cyanobacteria. This is just an infographic, the second half of the infographic from the last slide here. It just, again, this is something that EPA has sponsored in this way, but again, the symptoms of exposure can be ear and eye irritations, sort of like cold-like symptoms, headache. It could be respiratory. Some people with a compromised immune system might be more vulnerable to seizures or illness. There's also some sort of more mild gastroenteritis, abdominal pain, something like you just felt like you ate something bad. There's also lethargy and low energy, not eating, kind of just acting differently. And that's sometimes what people notice with their pets after they've been exposed. When in doubt, stay out is a good philosophy. You could also just take a photo and send it to our hotline here, the 848 number, and we can quickly let you know what we think of what you're seeing and help you through the situation. You definitely don't want to play in any scum or mats of cyanobacteria. You want to keep your pets away. It's usually okay to swim, but there's just a chance that you will swallow water, and you can get the eye and ear irritations by putting your head under the water. There is recommendations not to fish or wade, but this is a lot of just precautionary, like stay away from it, keep your boat out of it, don't touch it, just leave it alone. It will go away. But it can also last a whole summer. So there's a lot of concerns around how long you are exposed to cyanobacteria. And then something that I find very interesting as part of my research, I studied at the University of New Hampshire with Jim Haney, and I primarily focused on aquatic food webs and looking at the bioaccumulation of cyanotoxins. And if you think of a typical food web, not like a food diagram of what you should be eating, but in this case, a food diagram of energy flow. So starting at the bottom, the primary producers are those phytoplankton, the algae. They're producing and they're growing, and they're kind of like our vegetables and the like. And then you have primary consumers who are like animals who are grazing on those algae. They're like their little cows in the lake. And then you have more predatory zooplankton that then eat those zooplankton. And then you have some young fish that eat those zooplankton. And then you get up to where the top carnivores are, like large fish, birds, and mammals. And then they eat all of that. So there is a tendency for cyanotoxins to not just be toxic at the primary level, but biomagnify, get more toxic as they move up the food web. And in some cases, cyanotoxins dilute through the food web, and they're all a little bit different. And aside from toxicity, fish are affected by blooms. Blooms are not just toxic and, a problem because they're toxic, but they're aesthetically displeasing. You don't want to show up at the beach and see this. You don't want to see dead fish. And usually the fish are dying because the oxygen is changing and conditions are just stressful. But there's just a lot of unknowns about the toxicity effects of different wildlife. And that's a question we get quite a bit. Usually these fish are dying because of the oxygen changes, but some of them actually are dying because of the toxins themselves. And you think like, oh, this is really simple. Cyanobacteria, they're toxic. This is the way it is. But cyanobacteria are very diverse. They're as diverse as plants are. If you're someone who takes care of plants, you might know that one of your plants needs more of this type of nutrient food, and the other type doesn't want you to water it for the entire summer. At the same time, some of our plants are very toxic, and you want to keep your pets away from your house plants sometimes. So cyanobacteria are diverse. We see them in a variety of colors and shapes and forms. And I can come back to this slide for like later if you want to discuss all the varieties here, but this is just to show you that they're not always that like blue-green cloud or scum at the surface. They can be presented in a variety of colors. They come from different parts of the lakes. Some of them are too tiny for us to even see. And when they die, sometimes they even make the water look a bit white or cloudy or milky. There's a great diversity of species and toxins. I wanted to just bring up Gliotrichia because it's actually blooming right now. There's really no advisory for Gliotrichia, but this is a cyanobacteria that we're seeing in some of our biggest, cleanest lakes. There's issues with all of our lakes to some extent, but Gliotrichia is one that is blooming in Winnipesaukee right now, not to levels, again, that we would issue an advisory, but be on the lookout for these tiny little balls in the water. They're also been recorded at Lake Wentworth this month and Lake Sunapee. So this is something that is around, but does not look like your typical cyanobacteria bloom. And there are several UNH and New Hampshire researchers looking at Gliotrichia, Dartmouth, Colby Sawyer. There's a lot of different people, like Sunapee Association, researching this organism and its specific requirements for growth. And with monitoring, like one thing that we are really kind of looking at is the pigments associated with cyanobacteria. So even a lot of the groups that are monitoring Gliotrichia would maybe be interested in looking into the pigment association, but each of these organisms are so different and they give off a different signal. And at the base of all of these is chlorophyll. So cyanobacteria are producing chlorophyll, but they have unique pigments that sort of come out of the chloroplast here. And those include phycobilisomes that are sort of specific to cyanobacteria and sometimes red algae and some other organisms, mostly cyanobacteria. And so we could monitor by measuring pigments in the water. There's fluorometers, you could measure phycocyanin, phycoerythrin, and even chlorophyll. So there's other ways of noticing cyanobacteria. And this jar here, I mean, visually you can tell this is cyanobacteria perhaps, but as it begins to die and decay, those pigments get released, and that's what then is kind of white and left as a residue behind when they die. And during this time, they can also be pretty toxic because the toxins are held within the cell and it's toxic to consume, but when they die, they release some of those toxins, and some of those toxins can remain in the water for hours to days or weeks. Some of the toxins really degrade quickly, and there's a whole range of toxins. So when we see something white like this, it's a good sign, it's dying, but you still want to avoid contact. So these are the 4 most common types we see in New Hampshire. From top left, that's an organism called Dolichospermum. I talk about it all the time because it's probably the most common one. It is the most common one we observe in blooms. This specific species of it is really common in June, where it's all coiled tightly. It can produce anatoxins. The top right is Aphanazomonin. It can also produce toxins, but not always. We kind of see this throughout the summer in certain lakes. The bottom left there is called Planktothrix or Oscillatoria. There's different names for some of these sometimes. That one likes to live deeper in the water, sometimes creates benthic mats, but often is found like in the metalimnion or in the middle of the lake down deep. And it will rise at certain times of the day or year, and they can clump together and create those blue-green flecks that you might see in the water. And then the bottom right there is Microcystis. And this is also very common in our blooms and is known to be the most toxic of what we can understand based on microcystins. Microcystis produces microcystins, and that's the most well-studied. And so that's why there are a lot of guidelines around that specific toxin. It causes more of the upset stomach and gastroenteritis, but long-term digestive organ cancers like liver cancer. But at the same time, not all of the cyanobacteria are toxic, and even these organisms that I present here do not always produce toxins. Sometimes one day they could be toxic, and then the next day they might not be toxic. And there is sort of a genetic regulation to some of the toxins that from what we can understand. And so it gets really complicated to try to tie cyanotoxins to blooms because it can change. We don't want to give the wrong impression. We also just can't measure all of the toxins that may exist. And so we're not always talking about toxic cyanobacteria. We do get a lot of calls about green filamentous algae. And I think this is probably the most commonly confused, or just if you see it, you're kind of like, oh, that is that gross green mass over there. It must be something bad. Actually, the green filamentous algae is not that bad. It is unsightly, it is gross, it's slimy. Someone told me today they thought it was like the slime from the Ghostbusters. It is like that. And if you have a stick, you can just quickly like try to lift it up and see if it all sticks and slimes together, and kind of like this picture here. That could tell you right away if you are dealing with cyanobacteria or green filamentous algae. In this case, if you can lift it with a stick, you're probably dealing with green filamentous algae. We do have some benthic mats that you could pick up with a stick that do contain cyanobacteria. So always check with us. It's great to just send a photo. But if it's like a bright lime green like this, you could probably feel safe about it. We also see this tiny aquatic plant, duckmeal, I guess. It's a tiny microscopic plant, flowers, Wolfia, or we sometimes see lemna. There's just different very tiny aquatic plants that from a distance can really look like a bloom. But if you get a little bit closer and you can see like little pods on the surface and there's nothing below it and it's very coarse, you're likely looking at a tiny aquatic plant. We saw a lot of this on the Nashua River last summer. It's not cyanobacteria. We also see that some of these surface scums are Euglena, and these organisms can sometimes be toxic to fish, but we don't see this species in New Hampshire that is toxic. We see a good variety of different types of Euglena, but from a photo, it can be hard to tell if that's what we're dealing with. So we still welcome photos, even if you're just not sure. And so what should you do if you see a bloom, or if the water changes colors, you're just not sure? If you see a cloud, anything strange, you can just be careful and avoid contact, and just be cautious. Keep your pets and children out until you know what it is. At least keep it away from the accumulation or the cloud or whatever it is you're seeing. I really do welcome photos. I think it's the best first line of communication, just to clear it up, like, well, that looks like it's green filamentous, just leave it alone. Or, it's something that is more severe. So we do want you to take a photo and record your location and just contact me by email or cell phone is best, so that I can quickly see it, and we can go from there. What you might also want to know about is how can you monitor, how can you get involved? And I like to promote the cyanos.org. This is the Cyanobacteria Monitoring Collaborative that we have with the EPA Region 1 that sponsored it, but now it's more of EPA, all regions, all, country goes beyond the country, that people are getting involved with this collaborative. There's 3 tiers to it. And first and foremost, what we want everyone to do is be on bloom watch. You might be a weed watcher, you might be surveying loons. It's really easy to also be on bloom watch. You might just be out on the lake, just notice something weird, take a photo, and you can submit it to an app. And this app can also help us document where blooms are. I would also encourage you to still contact me with a photo so that I'm made aware, but it's just another way to contribute to a growing concern and a need to track blooms. There's also Cyano Monitoring, and if you're a volunteer lake association member of any kind, and you might be familiar with an integrated tube sampler, and the Cyano Monitoring is really just a routine way to sample the water and test the water for those pigments I mentioned earlier. There's a handheld fluorometer that can help you measure the relative pigments that might be associated with cyanobacteria. And it's a nice quick first look to see if you need to grab a sample and look at it under a microscope. And you could either bring a sample to me for that, or you could get involved and you could join the Cyanoscope team, which is really just as it sounds. You get a microscope, you go out and you sample, you can use a plankton net, and then you can try to identify what's in your waters. And I just want to remind you that every lake is unique. So I know that there's going to be questions about what are you going to do to fix this? How can we fix it? Can we treat it? We have to be very careful in our approach with monitoring and treatment. And a lot of times New Hampshire DES would require a watershed management plan, which is involved, but it's really just to identify any source external nutrients that are coming through that could be mitigated. You might have a road that's eroding into the lake. You might find that there's a really steep sloping driveway that could get a buffer zone and maybe divert some of that water. So please look at New Hampshire Lake Smart Guide and their resources, because they have a lot of good recommendations on what you can do. In very extreme examples, I think that DES will be getting to the treatment for certain lakes, but it's going to require a little bit of work in the watershed. And it's also going to require a little bit of study and money and trial and error, because all of the things that you're Googling about how to fix cyanobacteria might have worked once, but they don't always work, and they can be expensive and timely and frustrating. And we want to address any sort of easy, simple steps first before we decide to add chemicals to a lake, for example. So with that, I want to thank you all again for having me tonight, and I will, welcome any questions that you might have. So thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you, Amanda, for joining us. I do think we have a couple questions in the chat box. Gloria, if you'd like to go over some of those, and we'll get everyone's questions answered.
Yeah. All right. First question. Is Gliotrichia known to be toxic at some level?
Yeah, so UNH and a Dartmouth student, I'm trying to think of specific names, but Kaylin Carey was a Dartmouth student, and Jim Haney was on her committee, and Kathy Cottingham. There's a lot of good UNH researchers, I keep saying UNH, I'm sorry, I'm just used to saying UNH, but I mean New Hampshire researchers, and UNH was involved in testing the Gliotrichia for toxins and did find low levels of microcystin. That's consistent with some of the ones that I've tested recently, but we also know there could be BMAA, and some researchers are looking at that. Bigelow's done a little bit of work with some people in Wolfboro. So we don't know how toxic it can be, but there are a lot of researchers in New Hampshire studying Gliotrichia, and it does seem, based on its size, it's a low toxin producer. So relative to its biomass, it's producing toxins, but not to very high levels. And the Gliotrichia don't really tend to form like a scum to the level that we'd be concerned, but it's still something to try to avoid, because they can cause skin irritations as well. So it can be toxic.
I have a quick follow-up question with this one. And I was asking my coworkers at New Hampshire Lakes earlier this week when we saw you guys post this on your social media. I have been an avid swimmer in Lake Winnipesaukee for almost my whole life. And normally around August, this time of year, you start seeing little algae in the water that look very similar to this, even in the biggest, well, on the Broads, if you know Lake Winnipesaukee. So I'm just wondering, and I'm curious, how would you tell the difference between that normal plant growth this time in the summer and this particular cyanobacteria?
Yeah, if you're seeing like really tiny, like brown fuzzy balls in the water, I would bet that it's cyanobacteria, the Gliotrichia. I can't really, sometimes zooplankton might look like that, but they probably wouldn't cloud the water necessarily. They would be less abundant. So I think especially in August up to Labor Day is when we really see it kick off normally. Is all the towns that reach Winnipesaukee, all of the bays do have Gliotrichia. They've been observed pretty much everywhere to some level, but you can always just take a photo if it's convenient and send it just to confirm.
Wow. What else do we have, Gloria?
Let's see here. This question says, do you know of any eDNA research being used to regulate, trace, or manage cyanobacteria or harmful algal blooms?
Yeah, I think like broadly genetic work is really useful, especially when you're trying to understand the type that you're dealing with, because it can be really hard to identify these. So there are some like quick PCR methods that are really useful for targeting and trying to identify if you have that in your water. There's also PCR for some of the toxins, and that can be a useful test. We use an ELISA method, which is not genetic, but is also based on the antibody antigen complex, and the toxins do bind to these plates. So we find the ELISA method very useful for toxicity. But definitely genetic methods can really help us understand things much better, because it can be really hard to tell what's going on.
Okay, we have another question that says, how far away from a bloom do you need to stay away to be safe? And can you swim on the other end of a beach from where you see the bloom and still be okay?
That's a good question. And it's hard to answer that, because I think that, you know, a lot of times we're dealing with a bloom that's at a beach and the rest of the lake is fine. And it's perfectly fine to be out on the lake. You just have to watch out for the accumulation of the bloom. So the bloom is like that snow flurry that you see in the water. It's the little particles that those are all those microscopic organisms I mentioned. But during the summer, it can predominantly be cyanobacteria at times. So you're looking for this flurry in the water, but they're not at levels that are too concerning. We do use a threshold of 70,000 cells as a reference, but it kind of depends on the organism, the cyanobacteria that we're dealing with. I would say that sometimes it's just best to, if you can see it within view of your swimming area, I would probably stay out, because sometimes the toxins can be nearby or in the water and you can't see it, but the bloom is right there. And it can also be that you just showed up at the beach and it was all over the beach and now it's kind of moved. It's generally fine though. If you see that the water looks clear, just avoid where you can see it. I always compare it to poison ivy. Just get used to what it looks like and avoid it, because you don't want to risk it. And it really, you know, some people are totally fine and others are more affected. So it can be really complicated. So I wouldn't want to say, oh, you're fine. Some people have, you know, really sensitive skin, you know. I know, like, I got a little drop of a bloom underneath my watch the other day and I had a rash all over my where my watch was, and I was like, that's annoying. So I wouldn't even want to really dip my hand in and not wash it after in some cases. So proximity is hard, but again, if you could see it in view as something that looks like this, I would probably go on the other side of the lake where maybe it's not happening right now, but it depends. So it's hard to say.
All right, our next question, what are the main causes of blooms? And what role does phosphorus play in causing the bloom?
That's a good question. And, you know, I would say blooms just happen, and they happen in the cleanest of lakes, but collectively the recipe is phosphorus, nutrients. That doesn't just, it's not only phosphorus, there's nitrogen, there's iron, there's micronutrients that are very important for cyanobacteria growth. Warming temperatures, sometimes just, you know, even a degree warmer, like a month earlier, could maybe spark a bloom. Extreme weather events, in some lakes, rain really sparks a bloom. And in other lakes, the rain might help flush out a bloom or just flush the water. So again, every lake is very unique, but the general conception is that, like, more nutrients, warming water, those are sort of the things that spark a bloom, and that's what blooms like. And that's why we tend to see them really pick up in July and August in New Hampshire. But sometimes they are even in the winter hanging out, and it's like, why? What happened? What's going on? There's a lot more to it. And sometimes it could just be the competition, what else is living there, what is eating it, how is it being controlled, just biologically. It's complicated, but generally speaking, nutrients and warming water.
Okay. Someone is asking if cyanobacteria can be acutely toxic to herons.
That's a good question. You know, I'm not sure about the acute versus chronic effects, but we, again, at UNH did do a lot of research there. I have to say we did get a few times like great blue heron death report, you know, and we were very curious about like tracking it and all of that. And sometimes these things can kill birds like of this size. We've been looking at how loons might be affected. There's a very interesting study about eagles and coots and ducks, and there are a lot of studies that show that these birds can get toxicity. But what we're still, looking at is, does it come through the food web? Probably. Is it acute, like you're swimming at the beach? Maybe, but I think there's more evidence that it's accumulating in the food web, which is really harming them more chronically.
This person has had 2 sightings of cyanobacteria on their lake, but it dissipated quickly with the wind. And they're asking, when it dissipates like this, is it considered non-toxic at that point?
Well, I would say that the risk is pretty low, but again, it depends on what type of bloom might have just been there and dissipated. So microcystins are a toxin that can last in the water for days to weeks, depending how severe the localized bloom was, which is concerning. But I don't think that the levels, I mean, I shouldn't say this because I don't know, but usually we find that even our most, concentrated blooms aren't like super toxic, but we can't test all of the toxins, so it's hard to say. And also sometimes, again, the toxins can turn on and off. But I mean, if you had just seen a bloom and an hour later it dissipated, I'd probably give it a few more hours before I would swim heavily. Maybe wade would be fine, but you just don't want to swallow the water, put your head under when you think there's been a toxic bloom that just left the area within hours. I think that you would want to give it a little bit more time. But generally speaking, if the water looks clear, the risk is very, very low.
All right, our next question is about failed septic systems. There have been a number of studies identifying failed septics contributing to baseflow nutrient loading, but many watershed studies seem to focus on phosphorus from other loading sources. What's your opinion regarding the inclusion of nitrogen contribution to cyanobacteria?
Yeah, this is something I really think that we should start adding nitrogen to our routine water quality testing. I do think, especially for cyanobacteria research, we could benefit from learning more about nitrogen specifically. The source of the nitrogen, though, is a good question. And usually with our watershed management plans, we do like a loading model that describes what the potential phosphorus load is. And we do consider septic, that is a big piece of the pie. We always encourage people to check their septic and abide by the recommendations for use and maintenance. It is a huge concern and is probably a very large contributor across lots of lakes. But we are not really testing for nitrogen. We sometimes will test for other things to indicate there's a septic problem, but actually septic checks are really on the owner. Like, we're not going to come by and say you have to do this. It sometimes does come down to a town ordinance if there are real big problems, or a complaint that really leads you to a septic problem. But otherwise, it is considered in our nutrient loading models that septic is an issue, but nitrogen is not typically something we focus on. And again, I think for cyanobacteria, it would be worth looking into that more.
All right, next question. This person is wondering if there is any evidence or past evidence of algae blooms in Lake Winnisquam, if you happen to know off the top of your head.
Yeah, Winnisquam, yes. Well, somebody just reported a bloom to me in Winnisquam, and the photo is pretty telling to me. It wasn't a close-up photo. It kind of had that like powdery look to it, like it could be pollen, it could be a bloom. This was just last week, and I think it was in the loon sanctuary area, so it was a concern for sure. VLAP happened to be out there the same day, and we got samples, and we did see golden brown algae this year. I do know, like several years ago, I think before some waste management was fixed, there were blooms in Winnisquam, and in my time at DES, I don't think I've issued any cyanobacteria advisories there, which is, maybe around 5 years now. But I could look in the records. It's not anything that's been recent to my knowledge.
Someone would like you to clarify the alert versus advisory status.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're finding that when we issue advisories, we have to wait for a sample, confirm identification, and count. And it could just be like a really small area of the beach. And maybe that lasted for 2 hours and it's gone. So the alert is really not an advisor. It's not a true advisory that like, well, the cell count's really high, the whole lake should be under advisory. The alert is just a first response to share photos. Maybe it's already dissipated. Maybe DES showed up and it's not at the beach, it's at someone's house and we can't access it. So it's just to be on the lookout. And so it will not be on our map. That's a big difference, is it's shared locally as an alert. And until we can really confirm it's been around and people are seeing it and the cell counts are consistently, telling us we should issue an advisory, that's when we do. And so we recognize that we can't get to all of the blooms when they happen. Sometimes they all happen in one day and we're like, what just happened? We can't get it's just me and a few people and we can't really get everywhere. So we don't want to ignore it. We want people to know about it. And if by tomorrow it's gone, then maybe it was just worth having an alert. If it's still around days later and we have time, we're going to issue an advisory, and then we give it a few more days, because usually we're dealing with like a week of a bloom. That's kind of the average typical situation. We do sample weekly, but we also communicate with tons of people, a lot of you on here now, to just confirm, like, are you still seeing it? How bad is it? If I show up, will it be gone? We do a lot of driving and find, oh, we can't get to it. But everyone else is getting it. So we want people to be aware of it. And really an alert and an advisory are the same in that we want you to be aware of the situation. Alert might not be as severe because it's already gone. We have no evidence that it's anywhere. We're just going to let it go until more people are calling about it. So I hope that makes sense, but advisories are more official. They do go on our map. We do issue statements about them, but locally, sometimes it's just good to like share a photo and be like, hey, tell your neighbors this is around, might not be here, but it could be there.
All right, we have somebody wondering about the effect of large wakes on the bacteria from wake boats.
Yeah, so, when thinking about nutrient loading, it's not just external, there is an internal load of nutrients, and a lot of that sedimentation that gets into the lake does carry phosphorus. And think of like the historical use of your watershed. Was it used for agriculture 100 years ago? Was it logging? All of that stuff that happened in your watershed is now at the bottom of the lake, which is why a lot of lakes are moving towards eutrophication. There's more nutrients in lakes, and that can sometimes get stirred up from boat activity, pulling weeds sometimes, just kicking stuff up at the beach. So all these things that help like suspend these things can reintroduce nutrients into the water, where the cyanobacteria might be there benefiting. So it's another piece to the nutrient pie, basically.
Are there any good success stories of New Hampshire lakes or ponds that have succeeded in controlling cyanobacteria?
Yeah, there's a pretty big one that was done in maybe the late 70s, early 80s, and that was Kezar Lake in Sutton. And I think I identified a lot of environmental issues there. It was a wastewater issue. It did take a lot of work, and I think the most drastic example I could think of really locally. I could get you more details on that. I don't want to misspeak about it. It was a huge study, but we identified a lot of the external sources first. And then I think it got as extreme as having to dredge some of the lake and kind of restart. Still though, Kezar can sometimes have cyanobacteria, maybe not as severely, but it's still there to some level. It's just not an issue today. We also right now have just experimented a little with Nippo Pond in Barrington with alum. And I know that DES several years ago did more alum and copper sulfate treatments. I think that there's a lot of just temporary solutions, which is fine in a lot of cases. Perhaps, copper sulfate will kill the bloom, keep you, happy for 4th of July, but you might have to use it again by Labor Day, or you might have to use it again the next year. Usually these things become more of a chronic treatment than like a fix-all situation. I will also say that, sometimes lakes just bloom for like 3 years, 5 years, maybe. It sounds like a long time, it does, but without anyone really doing anything drastic, they just go away. And it has a lot to do with the dynamic of the lake, the weather patterns. Just sometimes we have good years, like you think of your gardens, or your landscape, and you're like, oh, this year this stuff just did really well. That's sort of the same thing with cyano. It's just sometimes they do really well and we're like, what happened? And there was the perfect storm of events that helped it that year. And it might last for like 3-5 years and then nothing, and there's nothing anyone really did about it, and you're wondering what. But I would say we do hear from a lot of people that after they've sort of mitigated stormwater issues, they did not find any more blooms. They've identified really simple solutions and it's gone away. But there are some pretty extreme examples. I would maybe look outside of New Hampshire for better examples, because there's some really great success stories, but as many of success stories there are out there, there's just as equally of contrasting findings with other methods. And I think you really have to know what type of bloom you're dealing with, and food web dynamics and nutrients that are not just external, but internal as well. So it is pretty complicated, but we're hopeful for NIPO with alum treatment that it's going to help. They've already done a lot of work with their watershed management plan, identifying some of the issues. We've also talked about aeration, sonication. There are a lot of methods out there, but we have to be really careful how you apply them. Sometimes they just don't work at all, and it's a lot of money.
Alrighty, we have someone asking, how does the rate of water flow in a lake impact the bacterial load?
So I often find that after a big rain event, like Memorial Day rains, then it was hot and stagnant for a few days. That was sort of like a good recipe for blooms, for some blooms. Then 4th of July, it happened again. It was like, wow, just, so storm water as a source can help the flow of a lake, but it can also bring in a lot of nutrients. So depending on the lake, flow is very important. Flush rate, the hydraulic retention time, if you will, all of that is another factor to consider, and how quickly the lake is turning over. But also, what is the source of that water? Where is that coming from can also play into the success of a bloom. But certainly the lakes that turn over faster are probably going to get rid of cyanobacteria faster. It's just a downstream effect though. Whatever's downstream might get it, but it depends. It depends on the environment.
Can it transfer from lake to lake on boats?
I mean, it certainly can. If there's studies that say if you go out to the desert, you can pour water on the desert crust and cyanobacteria will form and grow again from, a long time ago. So, dried cyanobacteria on a boat, or even wet, or in the ballast or whatever, yeah, you can introduce it. Even birds can introduce it, but will it be successful is the question. And usually not. It's not like an invasive species that's like, oh, I'm going to take over. It's more like, well, this is, either an ideal environment and I'm going to take off, or it's not that great and I'm just going to be what I am and not grow out of control. And that can be really hard to predict, but I wouldn't be overly concerned that you would introduce a bloom problem to another lake by boat.
Similar to the question about how far away from the bloom should you swim, how far away do dogs need to be away from the bloom to be safe?
I would say even further than people. It's just that they, consider their fur like a catchment trap, so the more they're in the water, the more that stuff can kind of stick to them, irritate their skin, but also just stick to them in a way that later they would be grooming themselves and might get, more than we would if we were just standing in the water. So I would be definitely mindful that if you can see it in view, I would definitely keep your pets away. I know it's very difficult to do that. I talk to a lot of people about what their dogs will and will not do. And if you're really concerned, I mean, there's a lot of lakes out there and they're not all blooming, and tomorrow it might be gone. So I would just say do something else for the moment, or find another spot that doesn't look like it's in the vicinity where you can see it. I would definitely consider your pets more vulnerable than yourselves.
Okay, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but just to get a clearer answer, when you get a warning, typically how long does it take to be clear to swim again?
Well, we are dealing with a lot of blooms and limited staff. So, I mean, we try to resample as soon as we can. We don't want advisories. But we usually give it a week, and there's a reason for that. It's logistically easier for us to keep track of things weekly. There are blooms that go away in a day, and that's why we've said, okay, alert might be a better option here. But oftentimes when we think they're gone, they're not truly gone. They're usually still growing in the lake pretty well. And it's just a matter of like, is the wind going to blow it down towards me, or is it going to be calm and it's all going to rise and get caught in the surface tension? The weather can really play a big part in this. And so I would say week is a pretty good run for a bloom, sometimes less. Unfortunately, we do have a few lakes that have it more long-term, weeks, months. But it's not something that's, with maybe the exception of like one lake I can think of, that it's not like a chronic issue for decades. It's kind of like, oh yeah, well, we've been dealing with this periodically. But normally a week, I would say, and that might have a lot to do with our turnaround time and monitoring as well.
Are there any herbicides that are used to treat cyanobacteria?
Yeah, there are. I mean, herbicide, algicide, I don't know if we're talking about the same thing, but yeah, like the copper sulfate is an algicide, and a lot of states do use copper sulfate, but it is a band-aid. It's a short-term solution that can actually cause long-term issues for water quality. It's something that you apply, you might be killing everything, and a lot of nutrients might be released back into the water. So not really helping the water quality in that way, but you might, have a bloom dissipate really quickly from it. But you might have to use it again the next year or more often. And so you are leading to more of like a chronic use of a chemical. And copper in itself is toxic. And I know that there are a lot of studies out there who use copper sulfate quite a bit, are finding their lakes are becoming toxic with copper. So like, we don't want that either. But, in the right dose and the right amount and the appropriate time, it might be the only solution to save our short summers, so I don't know where we'll go with that, but there's certainly a lot of different options for just straight up killing it.
Okay, we have a few minutes left here, so we'll see how many questions we can get in that short amount of time. If we don't get to your question tonight, certainly feel free to reach out to either us at New Hampshire Lakes or to Amanda with the email address she's provided, and we will try to get you an answer. So our next question is, if nitrogen can affect bloom formation, should people be able to keep chickens if they live on a shorefront property?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, you have to think of all the wildlife and all the animals that already are in our watershed. It would be kind of the equivalent of saying like, no one can have a dog. I think if people are following the rules, picking up after their animals, keeping a coop away from there, there is like an allocated distance. I'll get it wrong if I try to guess, but you need to keep your coop away from the water's edge. And sometimes these chicken are just free ranging, but they cannot be worse than the geese, I'll tell you that. And we do have a geese or goose issue. In my opinion, we have a goose issue because I also help with the beach program, and it's always a big cause for E. coli and other advisories, the beach bacteria advisories. So I wouldn't go around pointing fingers. Of course, everyone's doing something to contribute to the nutrient issue in the lake, definitely. I mean, if you had a whole chicken farm, that might be a different conversation.
All right, this person rakes the leaves out of their beach every summer. Is that something they should not do?
Well, okay, so the real rule is you shouldn't take anything out of the lake, and you shouldn't put anything in the lake. When it comes down to it, those are kind of the loose rules here. People do things that maybe they think are helping and shouldn't do. I can totally understand and relate to raking leaves. Technically, you're not supposed to. I mean, officially, you're not supposed to. But, if the water level's down and you have all this stuff on your beach, like, yeah, rake it and compost that. So what we think is happening with removing leaves and stirring up the bottom is that you actually are kind of like helping release more nutrients into the water column, maybe acutely at the time and maybe very isolated to your area. So if everyone was doing that, I could imagine it would, maybe spark an issue, but it's also nice to get that stuff out because it's also contributing nutrients. So it's a hard question in terms of like, how does it help bloom? But when I think about like my position here with the state is that you really are not supposed to remove anything from the lakes, even a bloom, unless there's a permit.
Okay, we have run out of time this evening. Amanda, I want to thank you again. This was amazing. Thank you for leaving so much time for questions because obviously people are very interested in this topic and there was so much great information here this evening. So we will be signing off. Just a reminder, this has been recorded. It will be on our website, and reach out to us if you have any questions that haven't been answered. And thank you again, Amanda. This was awesome.
Thank you guys. Thanks for having me.
Good night.
Good night.